Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. If you love America's forgotten and chilling history, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a story. Tonight, we take you back to 1798 Kentucky, where one family ruled there. Farm not with kindness, but with fear and blood asterisk. The land in Kentucky in the year 1798 was raw and wild. The frontier was still young and restless. The soil had been freshly claimed by men and women who came west seeking freedom, a patch of earth to call their own, and perhaps a fortune that could be made from sweat, and stubborn will settlers had begun cutting the forests, clearing ground for farms, and raising cabins out of logs. They were men hardened by the Revolution, women marked by hunger and childbirth, and children who grew fast under skies heavy with storms and summers that burned down hot and unrelenting. In that land a person could vanish without a trace, swallowed up by rivers, woods, or silence, and neighbors would speak of it in whispers only until the next season came and carried life forward. Kentucky's hills held stories that were never written down. Stories of men lost in skirmishes with raiders, stories of hunters who never returned, stories of wagons left broken. On lonely roads, people went missing, but the frontier was dangerous, and folks accepted that the wilderness could take a soul without explanation. Yet in dark folds of that land, there was one family whose name was carried on the wind long after. The cabins had rotted, and the farms had gone back to weeds. Their story was whispered because it was not nature that claimed the missing, but human. Hands and hearts cold as stone, the family did not belong to the wilderness. They were worse than worse than. The farm lay at the bend of a narrow creek, a good mile from the nearest wagon trail. The soil was black and rich, the kind that made corn rise. Tall and heavy, the cabin was bigger than most, with 2 rooms and a loft, smoke from its chimney often seen rising in the early dawn. Yet despite its fair look and the neat rows of corn, the place carried something that neighbors felt in their bones. People avoided it. They kept their distance, on the excuse that the family who lived there privacy. But the truth was simpler and darker. A shiver passed through a man's back when he thought of calling. At that door, there were tales of strange cries and the night faint lights moving through the fields long after midnight, and dogs that howled when they neared the fences. The family had settled the farm some years earlier. The father, a broad-shouldered man with a heavy brow, was said to have come from Virginia. His wife, a sharp-eyed woman who seldom spoke, was remembered for the way she watched a man when he entered her home, as if measuring his worth. The children were strong, tall for their age, their faces plain, yet their eyes carried something restless. Neighbors saw them sometimes at market, buying salt and flour, but seldom more. They sold meat, sometimes hides, 2 pelts of deer and wolf. Yet there was a question in people's minds about how such a farm with so few friends and so little trade seemed always to have more than enough began with a disappearance. A man from the east, traveling alone with his mule, went missing. He had been seen asking after the trail west, and was last known to have headed through the country where the family's farm stood. His mule was later found grazing loose near the woods. His saddle, stripped, his body was never found. Folks mourned the loss, but shrugged. 4 men vanished often on the frontier. It was only later, when another man disappeared, then another, that suspicion crept into the whispers. People began to wonder if all these strangers passing through the wild hills were somehow being claimed, not by chance or wilderness, but by the hands of those who called that lonely farm home. Travelers did not yet know to avoid the place, for the road was hard and lonely, and any light in the distance, any hint of a cabin, seemed a blessing to a weary man. A fire to sit beside, bread to share, a roof to sleep under on a rain-heavy night. But for some, those gifts were a trap. A stranger welcomed into the family's cabin might never walk out again, their fate sealed, not by wolves, not by river, not by sickness, but by men with no pity and hearts hardened by greed. Is said the father would greet them first, offering a drink of corn whiskey, his smile slow and heavy. The children would fetch food. The mother would lay out a bedroll by the fire, and in the dead of night, when the world outside was silent, the axe or knife would fall quick, and sure, a body would be stripped, hidden, dragged to some hollow, or thrown. To the river, bones vanished fast on the frontier. Dogs tore at flesh, floods swept remains away. No proof was left, only the silence of the woods and the memory of a man who never came home. The family grew bold, for each killing left them richer boots, clothes, horses, packs with food or money. The land gave them crops, but murder gave them more. They hunted not for deer, but for men, not for bear, but for strangers who crossed their door. For them, life was a market, and death was coin. The wilderness gave them cover. The silence of the land was their ally, and the fear of neighbors their shield. But whispers carried farther than they thought. Travelers began to vanish too often, and each story seemed to bend toward the same lonely farm. When men gathered at taverns, they lowered their voices and said the name of the family with unease, yet no man could prove it. In those days law was thin, and just as thin a sheriff might cover miles of land, and one cabin could hide secrets deep in the earth. For a long while the family lived untouched by any hand of law, free to carve their fear into the hills of Kentucky. Still, evil carries a weight that cannot be hidden forever. The farm grew thick with silence. A traveler who escaped once told of screams in the night, and a pit dug behind the barn where bones shone through the soil. He spoke of the family's laughter, as though killing were a game, as though a man's last breath was but a passing wind. His tale spread like fire. People spoke of it as if it were a curse that settled over the county. Some believed him, some doubted, yet in their hearts all felt the truth. There was no other way to explain the string of vanished souls. And so by 1798 the farm had earned a name, whispered in fear. It was no longer spoken of as a place of corn and cattle, but as a farm of death, a farm of horrors, ruled not by the wilderness, but by a family of blood. Their hands built fences, tilled soil, and raised corn, but also stained the earth with the lives of the men who passed too near. The family moved through their days as if nothing lay beneath the ground, as if the ghosts of the murdered were only shadows of trees. Yet the land remembers. The air around the farm grew heavy. The woods seemed to lean closer, as if holding secrets, and even the birds fell silent when the wind shifted toward the cabin. Still men kept vanishing, and still the farm stood untouched. A question hung over the county like a storm. How long could this last? How many more lives would vanish before someone stepped forward and faced the evil that ruled behind that door? The people of Kentucky in those years were bound by fear and silence. They were neighbors, yet scattered across miles of hills and valleys. A man might go weeks without seeing another soul save for his own kin, and the road was long and lonesome. For such men to speak aloud of their fears was rare, for fear itself had power, and it was not wise to stir it. Yet the whispers grew with every disappearance, until finally, even those who once turned their heads away could not ignore the shadow that stretched over their land. By then, the farm was no longer simply another cabin on a creek. It was a place of dread, a landmark that children feared when they strayed too far, and mothers spoke of in hushed warnings. Strangers still came west, for the wilderness pulled them onward, toward new beginnings. They followed trails, wagon ruts, rivers. They looked for light at dusk, and if that light came from the farm of horrors, then their fate was sealed. Some might last a night or two if the family's greed was not stirred too quickly. Others never saw the dawn, and so it was that the road itself grew tainted with blood. Travelers began to skip whole stretches of land, even if it meant hunger or thirst, choosing instead to risk the wild rather than the hands of men who smiled with knives behind their backs. Among neighbors the unease became unbearable. The silence of the land seemed heavier with each new tale. A mother wept for a brother who vanished. A son cursed the hills for swallowing his father. A wife waited at her cabin door until the seasons turned and hope withered. Yet in every story there lingered the same dark suspicion. All trails led back to that farm and the family who ruled it. Still, no hand of law came quick, for this was not the world of cities with courts and judges. This was the frontier where justice wore boots and carried a rifle. A man wronged must often be his own avenger. A community wronged must rise together or fall apart for a long time. The people did nothing. Fear kept them bound. It was said that the family could smell fear like a hound, and that they delighted in it, but fear also has a way of feeding. Anger, and anger once stirred is a flame no man can quench. Turning came one autumn when a party of traders vanished. They had been seen with pack horses and heavy bags of goods, and were last known to be traveling near the creek. A few days later, one horse was found wandering with its saddle-torn, blood dark on its flank. The traders never reached their kin. Their absence could not be explained away. They were too many, too careful, and too well known. The county could not ignore their loss. The whispers hardened into resolve. Men gathered in taverns by the dim light of lanterns, and spoke with grim voices. They told of the farm and of the family. They told of the fear they had long carried, and how fear had ruled them all. And then it told of how enough was not lawmen who first came to the farm. It was neighbors and kin of the vanished men. They came with rifles and axes, with dogs that caught the scent of blood. They rode hard and silent through the night, for no man dared give warning. The farm lay still under the pale moon, smoke rising faint from its chimney. The dogs whined low and pawed at the ground. The men spread out across the yard and into the barn and behind the house, and there in the dark earth they found what silence had hidden for 2 long, shallow pits, freshly dug bones, white as ash clothing, torn and stained with the marks of struggle. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the truth lay open before them. The cries that rose that night were not of beasts, but of men, cursing and gagging and calling on God for strength. The earth itself seemed to groan as shovels turned and bones rose to the surface. Some of the men knew the faces, though ruined by time. Others found pieces that told their own tale: a boot, a torn sleeve, a knife once carried by a brother. They knew then without doubt what had long been whispered. The family had built its wealth not by labor alone, but by murder. The farm was not a home, but a graveyard. Men burst into the cabin. The father stood tall, axe in hand, his brow heavy and dark. The mother sat silent, her eyes sharp and unyielding. The children huddled, but their faces showed no fear, only the cold look of beasts cornered. For a moment silence hung like a rope. Then rifles leveled, voices shouted, and the storm broke. The father lunged, but a shot rang out, and he fell heavy on the dirt. The mother screamed, but her scream was not of sorrow, but of fury. She cursed them all and spat as she was dragged down. The children fought with wild strength, biting, clawing, striking, but they too were bound. The cabin shook with the struggle. The lanterns swayed, casting shadows on walls that had seen too much blood. At last, the family was tied and thrown into the yard, their reign broken but not yet ended. The men argued deep into the night. Some cried for hanging at once, for the ground itself cried out for justice. Others said they must be taken to stand before a court, even if courts were far and slow. But the memory of the bones, the smell of the pit, and the years of fear weighed heavy on the hearts of all. They knew that if they faltered, if they gave mercy, then evil might slip through their hands and walk again on the earth. The dawn came cold and pale. The family was led to the very ground they had stained. The neighbors gathered in silence, faces lined by grief and anger. A rope was thrown over a limb. The father was made to stand beneath it, his face still defiant. Even as the noose was drawn, he spat once more at the men who bound him. He cursed them and swore that the earth would never forget. His words were cut short by the rope. The mother followed, her eyes still hard, unblinking until the last. The children, young yet guilty, were given no mercy. For the land demanded more than pity, it demanded cleansing, and so the farm of horrors was broken by the very people it had fed. Upon the bodies of the killers, swung where once the cries of strangers had been. Swallowed the wind, carried their silence across the hills, and the neighbors stood long in the morning light, staring at what they had done. Some felt justice, some felt sickness. All knew the land would never be the same. But even death does not end a story. The farm remained standing. The cabin walls still bore the stains of blood. The fields still grew tall corn, and the creek still bent in its narrow course, but men no longer walked near it. Cattle would not graze, their dogs would not cross its boundary. The place was cursed in their hearts, a farm not of life but of death. Some said they heard voices at night, long after the family was gone, screams carried on the wind, cries of men begging for mercy. Others said they saw lights moving through the field, shadows that had no form. The farm became a mark on the land, a scar that time would not heal. Though the killers were gone, their memory ruled as strong as ever. The name of the family became a warning passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. Do not take shelter where the land itself whispers against you. Do not mistake a fire's glow for safety, for not all warmth is given with kindness. And still travelers spoke of the road, still men vanished, though less often and less close. But every loss, every mystery was tied in the minds of people back to that farm, as if the land itself had become hungry, as if the sins committed there had seeped into the soil and demanded more. The people tried to live on. They cleared new ground, raised new cabins, and spoke of crops and children, yet beneath their words lingered the fear that some evil once woken can never truly sleep. Time passed, but the memory of the family did not fade. The cabin rotted, boards sagged, and the roof caved. Yet the place stood long enough for children to sneak near and dare each other to touch the blackened door. Every autumn leaves drifted across the yard, and every spring grass grew tall around the ruins, but none of it softened what people felt when they looked at that ground. It was as if the very earth remembered every rustle in the corn, every groan of the wind through the trees seemed to carry the voices of the lost. The farm had been meant as a place of life, a patch of Kentucky soil where a man could carve his future. Yet it had become a graveyard of broken hopes, a place no plow could turn. Clean stories grew with the years at Ka. First, it was the simple tale of the killings and the hanging, but over time the words twisted as they passed from mouth to ear. Some said the family had been part of a wider clan spread across the frontier, all working together to rob and kill. Some said the mother had been a witch who charmed men into trusting her with her sharp eyes and her quiet voice. Others said the children were not human at all, but born of some dark spirit that fed on blood. Every tavern gave birth to new versions. Some men swore they had seen the ghosts of travelers still walking the creek bed. Some swore they had seen the father's shadow on the hill, still holding his axe, waiting for the next man foolish enough to come close to land itself. Seemed cursed men who tried to settle there afterward found their cattle sick, their crops withered, and their nights restless. No family stayed long. One man tried to tear the cabin down, but his axe slipped and cut his leg so deep he nearly bled to death. Another tried to build a new barn over the old pits, but lightning struck and burned it to ash on the very night it was finished. By the third attempt, no man was willing to claim it. They let the farm return to wild, and the trees grew thick and close, as if nature itself wanted to bury the memory. Yet the memory refused to be buried. Children were warned never to wander too near. Women whispered to each other that the soil was poisoned with blood. Hunters who camped nearby said their fires never gave warmth but only shadows, and cold travelers who strayed close said their horses balked and refused to step forward, as if the beasts themselves smelled the death that clung to the ground. And in the winter, when the nights were long and the wind sharp across the hills, men told the story again and again, the tale of the family who killed the farm of horrors, the year when neighbors had to become executioners so that the land could breathe again. By the middle of the 19th century, when towns had grown and law had a firmer hand, the story was already legend. Yet legends in America hold a power all their own. They are told not just for fear, but for warning. They become part of how people understand the land around them. The tale of the farm was told at firesides to children wide-eyed with dread. It was told at crossroads to strangers passing through. It was told at taverns when whiskey had loosened tongues. Always the story ended with the same words: beware the light in the distance. Not every fire is meant to warm you. Not every welcome is given in kindness. Even As Kentucky grew modern, even as railroads cut through the hills and towns rose from the wilderness, the old story clung on older men, remembered their fathers. Voices speaking of bones pulled from the earth, women remembered the warnings given to them as girls never to linger near the creek. Some families, even, claimed kin lost to the farm uncles or cousins who had vanished on their way west and never returned. The tale had become not just history but family memory. Each retelling added weight. Each voice that spoke it gave it new life. There were those who swore the spirits still walked. A hunter once claimed he heard the cries of a woman calling for mercy echoing through the woods. A boy said he saw a man hanging from a tree, though when he returned with others, there was nothing there, only the wind through the branches. Some even said the family themselves had not truly died, that the noose could not claim them, that their bodies had been cut down in secret and buried by kin so that their spirits could walk the land in search of more victims. These tales were not believed by all, but they were believed enough to keep men wary and women careful. No one lingered long near the farm. The legend grew so large that travelers carried it beyond Kentucky. Stories of killer families on the frontier spread to other states and took root in other soils. Some spoke of whole gangs that built inns or cabins as traps where travelers disappeared. One tale told of caves filled with bones. Another told of wagons vanishing near lonely crossroads. Yet always the seed of the story was the same: a family that fed not on bread, but on blood. A home that welcomed not with love, but with death. A farm of fear that poisoned the very land. By the time the Civil War shook the nation, the farm had all but vanished beneath weeds and trees. Yet soldiers, marching through, spoke of the cursed place. Some refused to camp near it, saying they had heard tales from their fathers and would not risk the wrath of the dead. Others camped boldly and swore they heard whispers in the dark, as if the very ground remembered the screams. The farm had become not just a local tale, but a part of the larger shadow that lay across the frontier, a reminder that not all dangers wore uniforms or carried muskets. Some wore the faces of fathers, mothers, and children. As years turned into decades and decades into nearly a century, the tale of the Kentucky family remained sharp in the memory of the land. It was written in no law book, recorded in no court. Yet it survived because people needed it to survive. It was a warning about trust, about greed, about the darkness that could live behind the walls of a home. It was told to remind men that evil can wear the face of a neighbor, and that sometimes the wilderness is safer than the hearth. Even now, long after the last stones of the cabin sank into the earth, people speak of the farm. The creek still runs narrow, and the hills still rise around it. The land has changed hands many times, but never kept them long. Some say at night you can still hear a dog howl and the echo of a man's last breath on the wind. Some say you can see the faint glow of lanterns moving through the trees, though no man walks there. And some say that if you stand too long in the yard, you will feel eyes on your back, as if the family still watches, still waits for the next soul foolish enough to believe that a fire's glow means welcomed. The farm of horrors had long since fallen silent in body, but in spirit it spoke louder than ever. The story of Kit of 1798 became more than just a tale of killers. It became a piece of Kentucky's cute soul, a dark thread woven into the fabric of American history, a reminder that freedom on the frontier came with shadows, and that some families carved their place in the land, not with plows and sweat, but with blood and fear. Generations turned the calendar, and the world of Kentucky changed. The wild frontier gave way to towns and railroads, and then to factories and cities. Men no longer carried muskets, but rifles, then pistols, then machines of war. Women no longer spun thread at the hearth, but worked in shops and schools. And yet in the hills where the old farm once stood, the story still clung like moss on stone. The people who lived there could not forget, they would not forget, for the land itself seemed to hold memory, and no matter how many times men tried to plow it or build on it, the ground whispered of what had been. By the turn of the 20th century, the farm was little more than a ruined stone sunk into the soil. Timbers rotted away, and weeds grew. High, where corn had once stood, yet folks in the county still spoke of it. Farmers passing with their wagons would point to the trees and tell their children, "That's the place, boy. That's where the killers lived," and the children would stare wide. I'd imagine the shadows of men hanging from limbs or the flicker of lanterns moving behind the brush, even when the old road changed course and new highways cut across the land. The memory followed. It was a story that could not be buried. Historians who came digging for tales of the frontier found the story waiting for them. They read court notes that spoke faintly of missing men. They uncovered newspaper scraps that hinted at disappearances, but the full story was never written down because it had been lived, not recorded. It survived through mouths and memories, through grandfathers telling it on porches and mothers warning it to restless children. Scholars would say the facts were uncertain. The year was clear enough, 1798. The county was named. The family existed, but the number of their victims, the exact deeds they committed, these were lost in the dark. The people who lived it never wrote it because they had no need to. For them, it was not a tale for paper, it was a scar on the land. By the middle of the 20th century, ghost hunters began to stir interest. They came with lanterns and tape recorders, and then with cameras and microphones. They sought the voices of the dead. They wandered the creek bed and the empty yard, and swore they felt a chill where none should be. Some claimed to hear voices crying out in the night. Others swore they saw shapes in the mist, faces that flickered and vanished like smoke. A few even said they felt a hand on their shoulder, only to turn and find nothing there. These stories filled books and radio shows. They kept the memory alive for a new generation who no longer lived on farms or feared the wilderness, but still hungered for the taste of dread. The county itself grew weary of the attention. Some wanted the story buried, forgotten. Others embraced it as a mark of history, a way to remind people of what the land had seen. School teachers told it as a cautionary tale. Preachers used it as a lesson about sin and greed. Families told it still in winter evenings when the wind shook the shutters. The tale had become more than history. It had become a piece of American folklore, like the Salem witches or the Donner Party. It was one of those dark stories that reminded people not only of their strength but of the shadows that walk beside it. Tanned. Yet behind all the legends, behind the whispers of ghosts and curses, lay the Unspeakable, harder truth. Men and women had died there. They had walked westward with hope in their hearts. They had carried letters from wives, children's toys, rings, and keepsakes. They had trusted a fire's glow and the offer of shelter, and they had met their end, not by storm, not by wild beast, not by chance, but by human hands. That truth is the heart of the story. It is why it has never been forgotten, because it speaks to a fear older than the frontier, the fear of betrayal. The fear of welcome turned to trap. Even now, when the hills of Kentucky are green with farms and the highways hum with trucks, people speak of the place. Though the cabin is long gone, though no stones stand to mark the farm, the land is still avoided. Old men say no crops grow right there. Birds wheel overhead, but never settle. Dogs bark and whine at its edge and pull their masters away. Some travelers passing through late at night have sworn they saw lanterns glowing between the trees, though no house stands there. They say they heard voices calling softly, as if offering rest, food, shelter. But those who know the story tell them this: beware the glow in the distance, beware the welcome of strangers. Not every fire is meant to warm you. Not every home is meant to keep you safe. The story of the Kentucky serial killer family is not just the story of one farm or one year. It is the story of how evil can root itself in the most ordinary soil. It is the story of how neighbors must sometimes rise together and bear the weight of justice when no law will come. It is the story of how memory can outlive wood and stone, how fear can carve itself into the very land. The farm of fear was broken in 1798, but it still rules in memory, reminding each new generation that the frontier was not only a place of hope and freedom, but also of danger and shadow in the wind. bends the trees along that narrow creek, when the corn shivers in the fields, when the night grows to still, some say, the past still walks. There, some say, you can hear the father's heavy tread, the mother's sharp whisper, the children's cruel laughter, and if you listen long enough, you may also hear the cries of those who came seeking shelter and found only death. Their voices mingle on the night air. A reminder that some stories never die. They live on in whispers. They live on in warnings. They live on in the soil of Kentucky, and so the tale closes as it began, with a land raw and restless, with hope and fear woven together in the American spirit. The Kentucky family who ruled a farm of fear may be gone, but their shadow remains carved into the hills, into the hearts of the people, into the memory of a nation, for the past is never truly past. It waits, it lingers, it watches, and sometimes on a dark road in the quiet of night, it speaks again.